So in those types of environments, one of your job is to try to identify how the insurgency operates, mapping the network, looking for the folks that constantly overlap, which are I'm going to use words pressure point or the main nodes of the network.
Mm-hmm.
And as you start to identify those, then you start to focus on how can you deny, disrupt, and degrade that network over time to make it harder for insurgency to operate.
What do you got for me? Yeah, what do you got for me? Baby, would you stand and fight?
Mr. Nick Polce, welcome back to the Speakeasy Conversations here. Before we get into this really fascinating topic about special forces and counterinsurgency operations, though, I do want to speak directly to my audience. Yes, you right there talking, listening. You're probably out there doing something else while you're listening to this podcast. Thank you so much for spending some time on this podcast and listening in here. And if you like this content, folks, we're not getting paid to do this stuff. We don't pay our guests. And Nick, you can probably nod and be like, "Yeah, you're not getting a dime for this."
No. So have a good conversation.
Yeah, right on. But if you do want to help us out, and if you like this kind of content, it takes a lot of coffee to keep this operation running, folks. If you could head over to cooleyconservatives.com and click that little buy me a coffee button, we'd really appreciate you helping to fuel our efforts here. So, all right. Well, now with that out of the way, Nick, you're running for lieutenant governor, but that is not why you're here today. Today, we're here to talk about your experience in the Army and your training in counterinsurgency operations. So just to start things off, let's level set with our audience. Tell them about your background and why they can trust you on this topic.
Sure. So thanks again for having me back. I was looking forward to this conversation. It's right in line with what's going on in Minnesota and some of the other places. So my background, I spent a little over a decade in the Army as a Green Beret. It's a military or Army specific, U.S. Army Special Forces. And so part of our specialty is on unconventional warfare, counterinsurgency, foreign internal defense, direct action. There's several missions that the Green Berets train for, and in their their version of their basic training, and then once you get to your teams, follow-on training, and then you actively are deploying to different places around the world, doing a variety of those missions.
So in your experience with especially the counterinsurgency side of things, how much of that training do you go through? Like, do you have to learn the kinds of doctrines, the kinds of techniques? Because we were just kind of reviewing one of these things that I was looking at through some internet searching that I did. But it was the idea of how an insurgency becomes a guerrilla operation, becomes a revolt, the kind of phases of these things. Do you go through all of those types of things? And then, like, what is the training like to learn about how to handle these situations?
Sure. So just going back in time, just to real quick to understand the Green Berets. So in World War II, you had the Officers of Strategic Services, otherwise known as the OSS, and they had groups called Jedburgh teams. And so those Jedburgh teams were dropped into Europe and Italy and some of the other places behind enemy lines, sometimes alone, sometimes with small groups. And their job was to build a resistance, to act as a force that was bothering the Germans, was in a position where they were ready to receive other folks, were staging equipment, were staging supplies, etc., in preparation for that larger invasion that ended up coming in during D-Day. All right, so that was the initial thought process. And then after the war ended, what eventually happened is 10th Special Forces Group was stood up in 1952, and then President Kennedy, through a special written executive order, said these folks are going to wear the Green Beret, and that's where the Green Beret came from. So that background in insurgency tactics, in the destabilization tactics, was a foundation of what are now commonly known as U.S. Army Special Forces. So within our training that you go through, it's called the Q course. And part of that Q course training is understanding unconventional warfare, understanding the history there of the Green Berets and how that will apply into follow-on operations once you earn your long tab and your Green Beret.
Okay. So then in that training, like especially in the counterinsurgency side of it, what are the kinds of things that they teach you to be able to identify these situations are taking place?
Sure. So in different missions, so let's just take Iraq for example. So there was Iraq started off as a war, a hot war, shooting war, and then it transitioned
Right.
into somewhere between 2006 and 7 more of an insurgency type program where you had different groups that were trying to destabilize the country for a variety of reasons. So in those types of environments, your job is to try to identify how the insurgency operates, mapping the network, looking for the folks that constantly overlap, which are I'm going to use words pressure point or the main nodes of the network.
Mm-hmm.
And as you start to identify those, then you start to focus on how can you deny, disrupt, and degrade that network over time to make it harder for insurgency to operate.
Yeah, that reminds me what some of my friends who were in Afghanistan said, that one of their purposes was to build relationships with the tribal leaders to make sure that they
Hmm.
could gain some trust with them, and to your point, like, make sure that some of these tribes who might not be our, full allies, at least we had some relationship with them so we could identify if there was an insurgency element inside there, we could help turn them back to helping the country instead of whatever, you know, insurgency goals they had.
That's right. So the only way we're talking insurgency. The only way it works is if there's a population where they can be involved with and they can blend in, surge up and surge down. Kind of like Miles said, they swim amongst the fishes. So part of that, what you're talking about, is putting folks into certain parts of the country, and then their job is to operate as force multipliers, train the locals, build relationships with some of the leaders called key leader engagements, develop that relationship so that when insurgent groups come through or you identify the support part of it or the action part of that insurgency, they're more willing to provide information so that you can move to disrupt, deny, degrade those folks in that area.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Well, and then like you're saying with regard to the kind of training that you've gone through, putting it into practice, how much time did you spend in Iraq and identifying these kinds of things? I mean, actually, is there something you can talk about? Any examples of like putting it into actual practice?
Sure. So I did several different trips. Some places Iraq, some places not in Iraq. So we talk about Iraq specifically. The area that we were operating in would change. It would change, just like there would be ODA teams in certain parts of the country. And then if they were in the counterinsurgency mission, their jobs are in bed with. At that point, it was Iraqi army or types of the Iraqi units. Train them, teach them, and then sometimes you go out with missions on them, and sometimes they would be going out on their own missions, doing their own thing. So that whole building up the whole cycle of for them to identify, for them to find,
Mm-hmm.
for them to finish, meaning the find, fix, finish. And that's as simple as it could be capture, it could be more than capture. And then any information that they found from that initial mission was the E, which is the exploitation phase. We're reading it, figuring out what kind of information, intel that you were able to pick up, and then analyzing it, and then it goes back into the cycle again. So it's you think about this circular loop on it's constantly going. And the good thing
Mm-hmm.
about being in a military environment is that you can be more proactive. A lot of times law enforcement, I know we're going to get to this, a lot of times law enforcement is in the reactive phase, and they're investigating, they're coming after something happens. On the military side, when you're working in counterinsurgency, you're trying to work more proactive to prevent and provide, get out there and stop things from happening before they do.
Yeah. Well, now let's tie it into a little bit more of what we're seeing in America right now.
Mhm.
And like we were talking about off air, this idea of like the things that are happening in Minneapolis. And you know what, I have the article here. It was fascinating. The article that I saw, Hat Tip Lacrosse Tribune, a shadow network in Minneapolis defies ICE and protects immigrants. And the thing that called out to me, and I started to see these like red flags of indicators of the types of things we're talking about here, where it says they also created interlocking webs of dozens, perhaps hundreds of rapid response networks sophisticated systems involving thousands of volunteers who track immigration agents communicating with encrypted apps like Signal.
Mhm.
This is getting into like sophisticated, almost like guerrilla type operations.
Yes. And so we saw in Minneapolis, we've kind of moved, in my opinion, we've moved past the protests into more of insurgent like tactics. And you mentioned a couple of them. So early you see a lot of a structured command and control. You have a communication channel, which in this example, they use Signal. That folks are on. Then you also have structured operations. You have people that are the action arm. You have people that are the support arm. You mentioned the folks that are running license plates. Then the action arm, I would classify as the people that are actively pursuing confrontation with ICE agents, right? We saw whether they're driving their car in between the convoy or they're, screaming and yelling at their face or bumping into them.
Kicking
And so
out their
those are
taillights. We've seen all
right,
kinds of
right,
videos.
right. With the end state of trying to provoke a response so that they could get the optic from a legacy media, sympathetic legacy media, to then run a larger loop to frame ICE as an occupying force. And that's the end state of a lot of the insurgency type tactics is framing an occupation force and then positioning yourself to try to get sympathy from the population, continuing to force confrontations, get a response that you want, and then it just feeds this loop. And the goal is to get a bigger and bigger, more legacy media coverage, and then grow from there.
Yeah. And that I think is the thing that is so concerning about a lot of this is, and I've been saying it for months on this podcast now, these are not protesters. They are insurgents. And there's so much evidence out there. The idea of coordination, they're defining their roles. A protester just goes out and protests. But these are people who are defining their roles, just like you said. They've identified, okay, now this person's our action guy, this person's our, signals guy, this guy's our tracker. That is an operation. That is a guerrilla operation that they're forming here. And then, another thing too, like if it was just a regular protest, like I remember years ago when we had the Occupy Wall Street types of things that were going on, those were actual protests, little sit-ins, things like that. That's a protest. These are sophisticated operations. And the other part of it that's a little scary to me is in the list of things that you get into this phase of guerrilla warfare kind of stuff, which is, I believe, where we are now, the guerrilla warfare style, that the tactics that they're using. But it also makes me wonder, and it sounds like there's already investigations about where the funding for some of this is coming from. And it, based on what news reports I'm seeing, it could be coming from China. And I know China has a very, what do you call the doctrine that they have over there? It's their military doctrine is very specifically like asynchronous warfare is part of their doctrine.
Yes,
Do you have any
unconstrained.
experience with that?
Yeah, so they're unconstrained. So they view war in totality, and so they also, the way that they collect information, they also view differently than a lot of the Western doctrine. And so yeah, I've seen those same reports, and part of that identification of insurgent tactics and how do you counter that is finding the money, tracing the money, and then preventing that money from getting to the folks that need it, right? And so that the disruption, the degrading, and denying that ability to fund. And so if it's coming from China, which there are, I've seen those reports, and it wouldn't surprise me. They're communists at the end of the day. They're communists, and we've seen a lot of these tactics that we're seeing in Minneapolis. Mao put into effect in the 1920s and 30s when he was fighting that war against when they had that civil war going on, and some of his cadre, and then they kicked it out of China, and we saw it in Southeast Asia. When we were there in Vietnam, we saw a little bit of it in Malaysia, and we saw it in Laos, we saw it in Cambodia, and it spread throughout a lot of that Southeast Asia and parts of Asia as well, exported from China and the Communist Party.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up too, because that is I feel like it's one of those things that there's so many different rabbit holes that you could go down with this, but there's a thread that kind of goes through all of it, and it's this Marxist, Maoist, communist influence. These are their tactics, And now we're seeing it in America, and that really concerns me. So now, I mean, we're identifying these things, and at least today I just saw, it looks like the state police in Minnesota now are starting to actually enforce some of their laws, which is very nice to see. Instead of allowing this insurgency to continue and grow in momentum, it looks like they might be in the process of starting to put an end to it. I don't know. Have you seen any reports about that too?
I have watched some of the news, seen some of the stuff on social media where it looks like local law enforcement and state law enforcement have been out better supporting ICE in their operations, preventing that confrontation. The other thing I saw recently was they had those roadblocks. I don't know if you saw that. There was some video
Yes.
of roadblocks. And back to your point about these tactics, where in America you had a group of people that decided they're going to take over an intersection, build some random roadblocks, and then not allow cars to go through unless they were running their license plate. Now, how much of that was happening, if it was just one location or not, the simple fact that they're doing that shows part of that city for a little while was lost, meaning that you had that anarchy and you had that, again, I believe it's insurgency / insurgent tactics take over in certain areas. And now it appears the local law enforcement's regaining control, state is coming in to help them out, which gets back to what's denying, disrupting, and degrading their ability to organize, their ability to communicate, and their ability to surge up. Because that's the other thing that we haven't talked about yet, is also a big key, is watching them surge and then disappear quickly into the population, which you only can do if you have support of the population that's not necessarily involved. We'll call them sympathizers in and around that area.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it reminds me of something else that you just mentioned earlier, the idea of how these techniques, these tactics kind of all filtered their way through Southeast Asia. And I know, like, for example, my dad served in Vietnam, and it was the Tet Offensive where he earned a Bronze Star with a V for Valor. That's some scary crap going on. And like you said, that idea of a surge and then melt back into the population. This is scary stuff we're talking about if it's happening in our backyard.
Yes, and that's why I think after what happened with the things going on in Minneapolis, we saw a lot of veterans experience in COIN, counterinsurgency, a lot of veterans experience in unconventional warfare, start to articulate like, hey, this looks a lot like stuff that we saw, whether it was the GWAT generation, right? Afghanistan, Iraq, Middle East, East Africa, West Africa, wherever. Or, your father's generation in Vietnam, where we saw lots, specifically on the special forces side of the house, of building those facilities, operating in the middle of nowhere and trying to counter the communists that were operating in Vietnam, because we're seeing a lot of those same tactics, especially with the violence that erupted and that surge in violence with the shootings, a terrible tragedy death, the way that they were violently attacking law enforcement, the cryptid chat, the C2, the ability of cordoning off certain neighborhoods with people identified. Hey, you got section, A, you got section B. And that started, guys were starting like, hey, we really got to start talking about this and articulating what we know and what we've lived through.
Yeah, exactly. And like I said before, I think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we could have prevented the whole thing as if law enforcement would have just enforced their laws.
Yes, if the governor and the mayor had allowed local law enforcement to support ICE, and they allowed ICE to have the detainers, right? That's the big thing that we don't hear about very much, because ICE is operating all across the country, and we don't see the level of violence that we're seeing in Minneapolis, the letter of the lawlessness and that insurgency type operation. And a lot has to do with allowing it to happen by standing down local and state law enforcement for whatever it was, 3 or 4 days when it was going on.
Yeah, that is such a good point. And I think it's important to really emphasize that, because ultimately, one of the other arguments I've made is that the Democrats are going back to their roots. And by their roots, I mean like the Confederacy. They were the ones who created the Confederate States of of America. It wasn't, they split off because they refused to follow federal law at that time. In that time, it was the federal law that freed the slaves. They refused to follow that law, so they split off. They seceded. Well, instead of seceding this time, They're just creating sanctuary cities, sanctuary states. That is a disaster waiting to happen. And we've been seeing this disaster play out in Minneapolis for sure, and now other places in the country as well. But all they have to do is follow federal law. And to your point, all the states that have way more illegal immigrants than us, than Minnesota, they have no trouble at all because law enforcement actually participates in the process.
That's right, local law enforcement. So meaning they capture somebody that's here illegally. They then hold them in the jail and they get, okay, hey, immigration, we have somebody that shouldn't be here illegally, turn them over, and then it's simple. They come to the jail, they take them, and it's gone.
Yep.
And there's not this having to chase people down in the streets. There's not this having to go house to house to figure out where a person is hiding, which then creates all kinds of problems after that, because now you're on the street. Now we're seeing a lot of those insurgent type tactics, and then it just devolves from there into, unfortunately, the violence that we saw a week or so ago in Minneapolis.
Yeah. Well, and that is a good way to put it too. That when it devolves to that level, that's where things get really dangerous. And it's these sanctuary cities, these sanctuary state, these policies that are protecting illegal felons. These are fugitives of the law. That is a dangerous situation. And law and order matters. And thankfully, we have an administration who actually takes it seriously. And now, like I said, it looks like they're doing a better job of negotiating with the state police, at least, and some of the local authorities. It looks like things are getting better. I pray to God that is the case and it continues to improve. Law and order can win the day here.
Yes. And we talk about, I know we're not here to campaign. We love Wisconsin, and we do not want that level of violence. I mean, we saw some of that in Kenosha in 2020. That's down here in my part of the state, in the southeast part of the state. We don't want this state to be a sanctuary state. We do not want law enforcement here to not work with ICE to deport criminal illegal aliens. And the good news is that we are seeing and hearing in the news really since that violence in Minneapolis, a lot of the sheriffs, I'm reading news articles where more and more are coming out and saying, hey, we're working with ICE with the 287, I think it is, or 287G, a retainer to allow that agreement in place so that they can do things, like you said, law and order, and not have it turn into chaos and anarchy.
Yeah. Well, and well said, too. It's great to have candidates like you running for state office who actually respect law and order in our state. And if we can maintain that in Wisconsin and make sure we do not turn into something like a Minnesota, it is super important, folks. If you're listening right now, the elections have consequences. Mm-hmm. The consequence of Minnesota electing a buffoon like Governor Walz is you can see the consequences playing out right now. We have got to have serious people who have serious respect for law and order in the state of Wisconsin. That is the consequence we need in our state.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Because there has to, I mean, think about it, at the end of the day, if you're elected to a statewide office, your role is to run that state and protect the people in the state and allow them the freedoms to prosper and put structure in where the rule of law is followed and people can thrive and enjoy their life. And when that rule of law disappears and then you turn into a little anarchy / chaos, nobody wants to live in that. We don't want that. And we talked about, different things overseas. We do not want that here. I mean, we don't, guys that have gone overseas in a variety of wars as veterans for the last 60, 80 years, leave it over there. We do not want that back here.
No, that's well said. And I think that's another important part about this. You think about the economic impacts, the what do you call it? The quality of life types of things. Mm-hmm. When the stuff that's going on in Minneapolis, how many people do I know personally who refuse to go shopping in Minneapolis now? There's a lot of us right now who are not going to go there. I'm not even going to cross that river into Minnesota anymore. I used to go to Rochester and Minneapolis all the time, whether it's shopping or there's a couple of good gun ranges I like to go play around at. But I'm not even going to cross into that state anymore. As long as they're operating under this insurgency, I'm not going to take that chance. So that's economic impact on a state and a city, because of these types of policies. That's a huge deal. And I've also got friends over there who are seriously considering now finally moving back to America, crossing the border and owning some property in Wisconsin instead of living over there.
Good. Bring it back. We're going to try to unleash the Wisconsin economy here in 2027. Yeah, bring them across the border. It's right. Minnesota's such a beautiful state, and it's great people that live over there. But because of the chaos coming out of the Twin Cities and some of the other more liberal areas of the state, you're right. It's like, why do you want to be over there? I had a really good friend of mine that was, we spent a lot of time together in the military, and he just came back from overseas and he for a vacation, and he got a cabin up in northern Minnesota, and we were talking to him because he flew in similar around the time where all that chaos was going on, and he's like, I don't want to come back here anymore, and it's sad because he grew up there. That was his whole state, got a lot of family there, and he's like, you got any room in Wisconsin? I'm like, come on over, buddy. We got a lot of room for you.
I keep telling my friends in Minneapolis, hey, just move back to America. There's room here. Heck, even in Holman, right next door to me, there's a few lots available still.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, that's
No,
right.
this is a great stuff. Let's see. I think that was everything that I wanted to cover about the topic. What am I missing?
Okay.
What else do we need to know about this counterinsurgency types of things and really getting control back in our nation?
Well, what we're seeing really is preventing. So if backing up in time, if as this was starting to evolve, you had local law enforcement allowed to operate by the mayor and state law enforcement allowed to operate by the governor, they could have squashed this quickly, which would then have likely minimized any type of violence. ICE could have done their job. It would have probably only been a protest as opposed to what it evolved into, which is what we're talking about, which is insurgency or insurgent-like tactics. And so it's that cooperation which keeps us safe. And then also is communication where, hey, these are potential problem areas, and then let's get out in front of them before they become issues. That whole deny, disrupt, degrade in the operation, and that's a part of it.
Yeah, so just like recognizing the indicators and being proactive. That's a really good point. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yes, it's understanding back to guys that have lived it, guys that have trained in it, and seeing some of those indicators is as they potentially now we're seeing it gone and went violent. So now that we've seen in Minneapolis how quickly it can go from the initial, we'll call it a protest, just flex up into a more violent incursion, coordinated. Now it's like, okay, there's some type of movement in different parts of the country that want to be able to cause this chaos. And now let's pay attention to it, watch it, and try to quash it before it gets out of control.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up too, because it reminds me something else I was thinking, that these types of things don't all happen at the same time, at the same level. It's like they're like, what do you call that? Oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank on the terminology.
Well,
Like
different
sleeper
phases.
cells.
Yep.
And every little sleeper cell has its own type of subculture, and they come into these different phases of their group. So what we've seen in Minneapolis, like you just said it very well, it really quickly surged into an insurgency level type of operation. But some of the things that have been going on in Portland and Seattle, they've been kind of at that level, but haven't really surged into it quite as much yet. But maybe they will. Maybe there's just waiting for the right amount of momentum or the right catalyst to be added in. But yeah, I mean, and it's interesting that like the protest level, we see just across the river in Winona, there's been some very peaceful types of protests, but maybe that'll surge into something, or in La Crosse, for crying out loud. I mean, we just don't know where these things are going to go. They're already at the, what was it called? The incipient level, I think, was one of the phases, or I think I saw on, but it's the lower levels, it's not really flamed up into an insurgency yet.
No, so I got it right. It goes in steps, and if when you have command and control, and you have a focused plan on where and how, and you have a division of labor, and there you can move and decide where and when you want to escalate, de-escalate, and that's one of the advantages of someone that's running an insurgency is that you are deciding when and where to act, and in this example, law enforcement, the structured society we have is reacting to that as opposed, and so you're constantly able to move and then blend away, move and blend away, move and blend away. And so that's where that proactivity, identifying the specific nodes that you're seeing overlap over and over again, and trying to pressure those to minimize any type of C2, minimize any type of ability to do those type of flex and up and flex down.
Yeah. Wow. Fascinating topic. And it's
It
crazy that we even have to talk about it.
I know.
What anything else before I let you get out of here that you want the audience to know about? And how can they reach out to you if they want to ask more questions?
Sure. So we could talk specifically about this topic. We could talk about a variety of topics. We don't have to talk about the campaign, but my website is nicholaspolce.com. And then I also have an X handle at Nick Polce, WI. And then we're on Facebook, Nick Polce for Lieutenant Governor. So any type the email, we can X post, you can post on Facebook, and then we'll follow up with you. And it's good that finally we have a president that's addressing counter narcotics and addressing the drug cartels as a military operation as opposed to law enforcement.
Yeah.
And that to me is a big deal, much like when we switched from counterterrorism being law enforcement under Clinton to being a military operation under President Bush. There's a whole different laws and rules and regulations. You go proactive as opposed to, again, law enforcement is more reactive. And so I'm happy to see President Trump is treating narcotics, counter-narcotics, drug trade as a military mission now.
Yeah, I think that is a really interesting. I never even thought of it that way. I'm glad you brought that up because as a military operation, you can be more proactive. Mm-hmm. Law enforcement, you have to wait till something happens and then send in the law enforcement officers to clean up the mess, get the evidence, all that kind of stuff. But as a military operation, to your point, okay, now you can identify where the target areas are. Maybe you put in people who what is it? Like spy basically on what's going on there. That you have people that are the spotters and figure out what's going on, identify that and be proactive about eliminating the threats. So that's a really good way to look at it. The difference between law enforcement and military is that military can be proactive and nip things in the bud before they become problems.
Yes, and you fall under different rules, like Title 50, Title 10, not to get into the weeds, and then law enforcement has their own, I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but that's U.S. legal code, right? So that people that are actually doing the operation are remaining within the law, regardless of what the left tells you. There is a law that whether you're in a military, you're in intelligence community, or you're in law enforcement, there's legal code which allows you to operate within certain left and right parameters. And when you're in law enforcement parameters, are very different from military, which, like you said, you put people in early. They are collecting information to then find specific targets so that if there is a military operation, military does what it has to do, and then it moves on, and then the intel folks blend out and move on to the next thing.
Yeah, that's fascinating stuff, man. It really is. And again, it's
crazy
that we have to even talk about this stuff.
I know. No, Chris, thanks for having me on. It absolutely is something that we talk about more and more, unfortunately, because of what we're seeing in Minneapolis, and hopefully that's the end of it.
Hi, thanks for checking out this episode. If you like this content, then please visit cooleyconservatives.com and click the Buy Me a Coffee option to leave us a tip. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Truth Social. Oh, and you can get our content in your email inbox once a week by subscribing at cooleyconservatives.com. Thanks again. Take care and God bless.
I want you